Welcome and thank you for joining the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, or IFES, in this discussion series on democratic resilience in Europe. IFES assists electoral processes broadly defined across the world, and we have supported elections in European countries since the fall of Iron Curtain. This is the 24th installment in our series, and we have focused on issues ranging from election administration to inclusion, cybersecurity, disinformation targeting women in politics, abuse of state resources, and the role of Russia in European elections. If you have missed any of our previous discussions, recordings are available on our YouTube channel, and my colleague is putting a link in the chat right now. I'm Nikoleta Diossy, IFES Senior Program Officer at IFES Regional Europe Office in Prague, which is hosting this discussion. This event is part of a larger USAID-funded program of democracy assistance with the goal of supporting leadership that champions democratic practices and is made possible by the generous support of American people. Despite landmark legal reforms in Europe, correct behavior in the political processes and irregular enforcement continues to make the headlines in Europe. While the primary approach to political finance should be encouraging compliance rather than punitive sanctions, the threat of sanctions needs to be present to deter and make the role of money in politics more transparent and equitable. In this online discussion, experts and practitioners will help us understand the role of oversight bodies, law enforcement, and civil society organizations in detecting and investigating political finance violations. With us today, we have Alexandra Carmen Lăncrănjan, Chief Prosecutor for the Liaison Office of National Anti-Corruption Directorate from Romania, Pauline Matveeff, Member of the Board of Directors, Anticor Association from France, Stefan, Executive Director from Expert Forum Romania, and Typhaine Roblot, Senior Justice and Legal Advisor from Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust from IFES. After our discussion, we will open the floor for questions to our panelists. And should you already have questions or any comments, you can already type those in using the Q&A session. So let's start with the first round of questioning. And my first question goes to Typhaine Roblot, Senior Justice and Legal Advisor at IFES, and also a member of the Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust. Typhaine, can you please help us understand why it is important to discuss the investigation of political finance violations? So why are we here today?
Thank you, Nikki. First, welcome everyone. It's great to be part of this webinar. So through our global work at IFES, as you mentioned, Nikki, we've seen progress in the adoption of legislative provisions, regulations, code of conduct, regarding political finance obligations and sanctions, which are crucial to deter and make the role of money in politics more transparent and equitable. But corrupt behavior in the political process and irregular oversight and enforcement remain a concern, whether we look at campaign finance reporting violation or other types of offenses such as foreign funding in elections. And there are diversity of framework and country practices with numerous institutions involved, from state audit institution, election management body, anti-corruption agencies, as well as prosecutors' offices. So it's a great opportunity to be joined today by practitioners, lawyers, and anti-corruption experts to learn about their experience and identify good practices on the administrative and criminal proceedings regarding the filing and investigation of political finance violations.
Thank you, Typhaine. And next we turn to Alexandra Carmen Lăncrănjan, Chief Prosecutor for the Liaison Office of National Anti-Corruption Directorate in Romania. Alexandra, could you shed some light on the role of prosecutors in pursuing or initiating investigation and prosecutions in Romania?
Hi, first of all, thank you for your invitation. I am very glad to participate in this webinar. From the perspective of the prosecution office, I think that it is very important to highlight that the criminal proceedings and the criminal framework are the last resort legal proceedings when we talk about frauds or violation of electoral law. So the prosecution office only intervenes when there is no discussion about the criminal activity regarding electoral process. So the role of the prosecutor is actually to investigate and pursue only those types of activities which can be seen as a crime in the legislation of the state. So it differs when we talk about Romanian law, for example, the role of the prosecution office is actually to safeguard the public interest and the general rights of our citizens. So this is why we can intervene even when there is no official complaint. So we can start the investigation ex officio if we believe that there is a criminal activity regarding the electoral process. If we talk about other law systems where the role of the prosecutor is a little bit different, we can see another framework where the prosecutor intervenes only when he or she has a complaint. So, but basically, the role of the prosecution office is actually to be the last resort of the law and of the state when we talk about violation of electoral fraud, of electoral law.
Thank you, Alexandra. I now want to ask a question to Pauline Matveeff, member of the board of directors from Anticor France. In the past few years, Anticor has raised alerts at a series of alleged violations on political finance by high public officials and filed a range of legal actions. This is quite impressive. So could you tell us a little bit more about the specific procedure that allows CSOs or civil society organizations to file these legal actions?
Yeah, sure. It's actually very interesting what Alexandra was saying, because we have a very different system in France. So we have a system in which institutions and legal procedure rules make it very, very difficult to raise a complaint against in political and financial matter. And this is mainly due to three specific reasons. So one is in corruption cases, a simple citizen cannot raise a claim because is not considered a victim of such criminal offense. And the second leg of that system is made with that the prosecutor in France retains complete discretionary authority to initiate an inquiry or launch criminal proceedings in case of corruptions. So he can do it or not do it. He doesn't have to justify himself or herself. And the third leg of this weird system is that in parallel, the prosecutor's ultimate hierarchical authority is the Ministry of Justice. So you can, of course, imagine that when you have friends or political allies of the ministry involved, then it's very difficult for the prosecutor to go on. And that's where our association, Anticor, as well as two others, Transparency International and Sherpa, enter into the game. We actually have a permit from the Ministry of Justice to be able to file criminal claims for corruption. And especially we can be considered as victim, and we can literally take the cases from the desk of the prosecutor and bring into an independent investigating judge, which is not subject to the ministry hierarchical power. So basically that's how we enter into the game. We're kind of the little piece that is like helping the whole system to roll. And as a food for thought, we actually have filed a claim against the Ministry of Justice. So you can imagine that the prosecutor depends on the Ministry of Justice for a career. We depend on the Ministry of Justice for a permit. And so the system is not perfect, but that's how it's working today.
Thank you, Pauline. That's very interesting. And next, I will turn to Laura Stefan, Executive Director from Expert Forum Romania. Laura, you led the regional research with the support of Silly Institute and IFES on investigation and sanctions of political finance offenses. Can you tell about your preliminary findings?
Yes, and I will start with the last sentence spoken before my intervention. The system is not perfect. Yes, the system is not perfect in many countries. There's no silver bullet. but we did find ways in which countries deal with the fact that they have multiple institutions that interact with each other in the field of fighting electoral illegal funding or public procurement fraud. The question is, when should we be using particular types of liability? And as Ms. Lăncrănjan explained in the beginning, criminal liability comes as the last resort. And the practice of throwing everything towards criminal investigation bodies is maybe not the most efficient of them all in terms of dealing with misbehavior close to the moment when it was committed, and with a sanction that has both a deterrent effect, but also an effect on pushing behavior towards compliance rather than non-compliance. So we had an interesting discussion with the authorities, with the French authorities and the American authorities, as to how do they deal with this challenge in their own activity. For example, the American authorities were talking about intent, about criminal intent. Whenever there's clear criminal intent, we go on the criminal liability route. And also they employ an interesting practice of a central clearinghouse, which means that consistency is the essence of criminal investigation. So what they want to ensure is that the same behavior, irrespective of where it happens, receives the same response from the state. Therefore, to ensure unity in the way in which prosecution deals with electoral fraud, they employ this central clearinghouse where cases are referred to a central entity, which okays basically the investigations. And that is a way in which investigations are seen as being equal, irrespective of whom is being investigated. The question about sanctions is not so much, as Typhaine was saying, whether we have sanctions or not in the law. The question is really about enforcement. So the fact that we have sanctions in a particular law doesn't necessarily mean that those sanctions are going to be enforced properly, and it doesn't mean that they will be enforced equally against all those that break the rules. And I think this is a key question of credibility in a way, and this transpires from the conversations we had with all practitioners, irrespective of the country.
Thank you so much, Laura. Let's move to another round of our questions. Aside from the legal framework and mandate of your respective institutions, I am really curious about to learn more about the challenges you face as a practitioners to effectively end impunity. So let me turn to Typhaine. IFES attended the International Anti-Corruption Conference in DC last year in December, where you had the opportunity to discuss the challenges of bias or perception of bias of prosecutors when they initiate prosecution on election crimes. Can you share a bit more on their challenges?
Yes, of course. And I think as Laura just mentioned, we had this great discussion in DC on the margin of the IECC together with the Silly Institute. And this positive exchange we had with the prosecutors from the US or from France, where they shared, I think, their common challenge regarding this perception of bias in their action or investigation of political finance related violations. And the US shared their set of guidelines that they have come up with, which talks about investigation restraint during an election cycle, so that they do not create the perception of interfering in the election process. So that's a quite interesting practice, I think, to look at. The French prosecutor also, of course, shared the same challenge as their colleagues in the US. They don't have written guidelines, and as Pauline shared, they have discretionary power in initiating their investigation. But of course, some of their action as well, like when they file cases against a ruling party, like the recent prosecution that's ongoing in France, can also be send messages towards this impartiality of the office. But of course, I think it's still a challenge to find this balance between quickly, especially for criminal investigation, to quickly size the opportunity when the evidence is available, because there's a scandal or because there's whistleblower that makes all this evidence available and accessible. And of course, this, on the other side of the balance, not to be perceived as favoring one side or going after a specific political party during an election process.
Thank you so much, Stefan. I will now turn to Alexandra. These challenges probably resonate with the practice of the National Anti-Corruption Directorate in Romania. These types of investigations also require high skills on auditing and financial background. Sometimes the evidence may be only available in another country. So how do you deal with these challenges?
So first of all, the Romanian legislator actually has a different approach than the legislator in France or in the United States, and we do not have specific crimes that regard the electoral process from the point of view of the financing of the electoral process. Romania nowadays does have specific criminal crimes in the criminal code regarding the electoral process, but only in respect to corrupting the voters or document fraud regarding the process, and not actually financing. So we have to turn to the basic crimes, for example, embezzlement or corruption cases that have this specificity of being committed in the electoral process and regarding financing of the political parties. But we do have logistic problems as well. For example, one of the most stringent problems is the moment that a criminal complaint or enough information about the crime being committed reaches the National Anti-Corruption Directorate. So it usually takes a long time for the prosecution office to start an investigation, and as my colleague said, crucial evidence is not available, or it's very hard to get. From the perspective of the financial knowledge or auditing knowledge, our institution has specialists that are employed in our in the DNA that do help us with financial investigation and have proficient skills in auditing, and cooperating with other states, it depends on the jurisdiction. So if we talk about cooperation inside the European Union, actually now that we are using the European investigation order, things are pretty easy. They have strict terms, so we have no problem. If we talk about other countries, and if we talk about other countries that usually are seen as financial paradises, or they are very opaque regarding the bank system, that usually tends to actually stall the investigation or leave a breach in the evidentiary status of the investigation. So we do try to have direct contact and gather the evidence, but there are some jurisdictions in the world that will not cooperate. So we have nothing to go on in this respect.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. My next question is to Pauline. Pauline, let's continue exploring the practical challenges faced. As an NGO, resources are not unlimited, and the legal proceedings tend to be lengthy and costly. Can you share examples of the challenges you have faced to initiate a legal action or pursue a case before courts?
Sure. Well, as you say, resources of NGOs are limited, but I guess so are some government bodies as well, right, regarding corruptions. However, I think our main challenge, so money taken on the side, because that's a real thing. One of the challenge we have is to find the evidence, of course. So we are NGO, we don't have like political, we don't have policers, we don't have people making inquiries for us, so we don't have an inquiry service. And people who go to us usually have these expectations that we can solve everything because we're specialists, but we have a small team. So how we do for finding the evidence when we think we should. So our first and main thing is we cooperate with the press a lot. So either we rely on the articles, so we can file a claim on the basis of the article, like we don't have the evidence, but we know this journalist have. So that could be one thing. Another thing that we can do is actually get the evidences from journalists. That's an option. So we have good cooperation with some independent investigation media in France. And that is also good for the process, because the media have a right to protect their sources, which we don't have as a normal citizens. And it's important for people who have disclosed this information to be correctly protected. And that is one of our other challenges, is the protection of the whistleblowers. So we really try to, so we have like independent, safe IT reporting channels you can talk to us through, so that, you know, you can exchange documents and so on. So it's really, we're taking good care of protecting them. So we are actually founders of the House of Whistleblowers in France, which is like a cooperation of NGOs trying to bring like economic, social, psychological support, legal support, obviously, to whistleblowers. And that's one of the main things we do. And the last one, I think, is to have access to the source still, is about documentation. So administrative documents are supposed to be public, not all of them, of course, but a lot of them. And we have this organization in France, this institution, which is l'ACADA, the Commission for Access to the Administrative Documents. And it's, so we're usually going to them saying, hey, we're looking for that, and the municipality or the region or whatever government body doesn't want to give it. So they can tell us if it's, so we have a real fight on transparency, because when we have the document, it's much easier to go forward. And and that's where the knot of the problem is, transparency and access to the document. Even if it's supposed to be published, it sounds difficult to get it. Yeah, we could say a lot more, but I guess these are the key ones, like the evidence, the whistleblower protection, and the transparency on the administration side are our main challenges, aside for money.
Thank you, Pauline. And my last question for this round is for Laura. Laura, you have heard the challenges discussed by the proceeding panelists. Do you face similar challenges of, for example, what you heard Pauline was just mentioning, or do you hear similar challenges from your other colleagues from other anti-corruption initiatives?
So I think some of the challenges are common. I will add a few more that we are seeing these days, but I would start by explaining a little bit the angle that we come from in our work. So we have a long-standing program of monitoring investment funds that are given by the Romanian state to local communities to invest in infrastructure. And we've been starting to map, and I've added in the chat the link to the online tool. We started to map projects, money, and companies wherever possible. And what we have been able to show is that some of these companies are politically connected. I mean, mostly the ones that win tenders, because this is the companies that we're interested in. And then we realized that there's a gap in terms of knowledge, because we don't have unified information as to who has donated to political parties, whether natural persons or legal persons. And from this need came our next online tool, which is Impunity, where we're trying to map all the resources, all the financial resources that go into the political life in Romania, and also, to the extent possible, write reports and look at the expenditure of these funds. Now, some of this information was so-called public, meaning that it was published somewhere in the official gazette on paper. So basically, people could not have access to it because you can't possibly expect an ordinary citizen to go by, I don't know what part of the official gazette and start reading lists of names of people or companies. So what we have done was to aggregate the information that was already out there. And then we started to demand more from our electoral permanent authority in terms of information, including with regard to audits and controls they've done to political parties. And there's an interesting development on this front too, because we have been refused access to various types of documents that exist in the public administration body that is called the Electoral Permanent Authority. As Pauline was saying, although they should be public, not all administrative acts are public. And we sued. So we started using strategic litigation on freedom of information to actually access information that is already held by the government. And the defense used against our request was personal data. So for GDPR reasons, we can't tell you what we found when we controlled a particular party, which is of course funny, and the court has ruled in our favor. But I think this threat of closing public information for GDPR claims, I call them claims because they have been invalidated in some cases by courts, I think it's stronger and stronger every day. Another thing that I see in common with what Pauline was describing is our constant effort to work with investigative journalists, because we put out data, but we are not investigators ourselves. We're neither police officers nor investigative journalists. So our common interest, I think, is for us to make as much publicity as possible to our tools so that others that have this role of investigating can go and look into them and produce interesting investigations. And actually, there are a few good examples where investigative journalists have used this data and produced investigative pieces, and then prosecutors have started prosecuting those cases. So I think it can be done. It takes a lot of effort. We have a group of colleagues that are working on this almost day and night. It has to take effort and stubbornness, I think, to dig for this data and make it available. But I think it pays off at the end of the day.
Thank you so much, Laura. So let's move to another set of questions. The diversity of institutions and the sometimes blurry distinction between admin, civil, and criminal offenses and sanctions may be quite challenging for practitioners and probably require effective sharing of evidence and referral mechanisms among anti-corruption bodies, EMBs, and law enforcement. So my first question is to Alexandra. Is interinstitutional cooperation between oversight, electoral bodies, police, and National Anti-Corruption Directorate in Romania effective? And can you share some examples?
It's a tricky question because it has different answers. It depends on what the situation is, and I'm not talking here of acting in bad faith from any of those institutions, but it's sometimes overlapping the activities of the administrative bodies and of criminal investigative bodies can have a bad result. For example, if the administrative and civil control bodies actually end their investigation with a sanction which is legally civil, it can actually impact the investigation of our directorate, because usually the claim of the suspects or of the persons involved is applying the nebis in idem principle, and actually qualifying the administrative investigation and sanction as a criminal sanction in the view of the European Charter of Human Rights. So actually impeding further prosecution. So the first thing that has to be taken into consideration by all of these authorities that have shared competence is the point where they have to stop and redirect the claim to another specialized body. So usually the administrative and civil institution are those that have the competence of filing a claim to the National Anti-Corruption Directorate and give us their findings and the documents that are legally required to gather and to hold in the electoral process. There are another category of institutions, MLAs and police offices, which can direct information and intelligence to the prosecution office. So that helps us a lot if it happens, because it gives us information to start our investigation earlier in time and closer to the actual crime. But after the moment the Directorate was started the investigation, there is little overlapping with other institutions. They can actually be requested to give documents that they have, but their investigation powers stop once the criminal investigation starts. So, and this should be the normal way of not overlapping investigations. So once you decided that it's not civil and it's not administrative and that is a criminal violation, all the investigation goes to the prosecution office. We do not have the capabilities, and it's a large discussion in Romania, for example, if we have legal grounds to actually request an administrative body to check or to do an administrative investigation inside and at the same time as the criminal investigation. My opinion is that once we decided it is criminal, it's a criminal matter, the only institution that can actually request and check things is the prosecution office. But overall, once they are requested in Romania, not very quickly, but in due time, do give us all the documents that they have. I think it's easier and quicker for the prosecution office than it is for NGOs or other private persons.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. Pauline, I have another question for you. I understand that Anticor sometimes file cases along with other NGOs. In such cases, do you also share your investigation resources and file jointly?
Yeah, well, Anticor is one of the 3 anti-corruption associations which has a permit in France. So we certainly do not work alone. And as I said, we're really small, so we do favor joint work. We have many, like, let's say, options to work together with other NGOs for cases. So one is, of course, that the NGO is not prepared for a corruption case. It's defending its ground, whatever the topic they want to defend, and they end up on a corruption, or at least on a suspicion of corruption, and then they come to us saying, well, can you help? So then, depending on how it goes and what they want to do, we can bring the action alone, and we can as well bring it together. So it has happened already with some environmental NGOs. I think we found with Greenpeace last year something about a conflict of interest in a board of director of a large school in France. And so we can do it together, and when we do it together, we actually prepare the case together. I mean, we have teams that are partnering. So that can be the case for specific topics such as environment. That can be the case when several anti-corruption associations are actually jointly fighting. And in that case, again, this is prepared together. There is no point doing it separately. We might have as well, in some minor cases, very simple associations like neighborhood association, like these neighbors, they disagree with this urbanistic decision. So they join forces, like several neighbors together, and they would come to Anticor. And in this case, we would have the permit to do the thing, but they can file the claim as well together with us at the beginning as well. So yes, we certainly do that. Aside from claims, I think that we also do is getting in touch with a lot of association in let's say countering or at least monitoring lobby actions. And this is also a place where we have a lot of NGO interconnections all the time, because they do that as well. So we have, for example, I was mentioning earlier, the House of the Whistleblowers that we've been building up, and we've been doing that together with a lot of association trade unions. I don't know, for example, Bloom, which is an association defending the sea. So it's something completely different, but they actually connect with this financing of political and financing actions. So yeah, we do that together, and we do help each other. I take the chance that I forgot last time you asked me about the challenges. One of them is the length of the legal proceedings. So I'm just adjusting that. I mean, you will all understand what that means, but we sometimes lose the momentum, which is also a key thing when you have a partnership with the NGO, right? Because you want to keep the momentum and what's going on. And when it takes decades to get a decision, then, well, obviously the civil society behind us having trouble understanding what's going on. But yes, we do definitely partner, and yeah, we do.
Thank you so much, Pauline. Laura, next question is for you. From your expertise, what are the necessary components of cooperation between administrative institutions and criminal ones so far to bridge the potential loopholes and avoid lengthy criminal proceedings? And what should go to Prosecutor and what should be under the civil procedures?
Yeah, so I think from the previous explanations, it becomes even more clear that we should be aiming to answer a few questions. Basically, when should the administrative control bodies notify the prosecutors, and when should they stop doing whatever they're doing in terms of sanctioning misbehavior through administrative tools? One. Second, what happens if the prosecutors don't find that they have enough to build a criminal case and they stop criminal investigations? Can the administrative body regain competence, and should they regain competence? And if we add to this the little spice of long criminal investigation procedures, we see what the challenge really is. The challenge is to come with a sanction that has a deterrent effect close to the moment when the misbehavior happened, particularly in cases of political finance violations. I mean, these are time sensitive. Campaigns happen during short periods of time. Elections are held. Various political players win these elections. And I think here you have to factor in also the element of potential political, perceived or real undue influence on the investigators, be them criminal investigators, prosecutors, police, or administrative control bodies. So what I think is key is to have transparent guidance as to what should fall in particular categories. In particular, because all these things happen because someone complains usually, or because someone has written an investigative piece. And it's important for all these external players like civic activists or journalists to also understand how this fits into the bigger picture of the criminal legislation and administrative legislation. Ms. Lăncrănjan was discussing about the fact that we're many times, when it comes to politically sensitive crimes, we're missing a particular incrimination for that particular crime. And that is true both for political violations to political finance legislation. And it so happens, because it's also a lot of money, when it comes to violations of public procurement rules. So what happens then? Then the criminal investigators have to rely on more generic crimes. And then, the arguments start. Are they stretching the incrimination too much to cover behavior that is not necessarily criminal? Are they taking a very narrow view at what should be comprised by, I don't know, for example, abuse of office and similar crimes? And the question of non bis in idem, at least for the EU countries, for countries, well, not necessarily EU, under the European Court of Human Rights jurisdiction, this question is very relevant. And it can also offer escape routes for smart players, right? I would rather be sanctioned with a minor administrative sanction than face the risk of being targeted by criminal proceedings. And in the early days of anti-corruption, where in Romania, we have seen situations where administrative control bodies were basically issuing letters to suspects saying, I just want to let the prosecutor know that in so-and-so behavior, there is no damage generated to the state budget. So basically, letters of benevolence in a way, right? I think all these elements have to be put into the puzzle, and I think I stress the importance of having transparent rules, clear and transparent rules. Whether it's criminal intent, whether there's a threshold of damage that has been generated, or a threshold of importance of the criminal behavior, but there needs to be something that is, to the extent possible, objective, so that it cannot be manipulated, and it's seen to be equal for all the players.
Thank you so much, Laura. And my last question for this round goes to Typhaine. Across your support to EMBs and judiciary on election malpractice and election crimes, what good practices can IFES share to enhance interinstitutional cooperation?
Thanks, Nikki. And again, I'm going to build on what the other panelists just mentioned, this issue with overlap of jurisdiction that we see a lot, that often leads to inaction or misperception because of the public. For instance, an election management body will have political finance violation mentioned in its code of conduct with some, power to issue warnings or fines. However, it's also defined as a criminal offense. Therefore, they're just going to refer potentially those cases directly to the prosecution. However, the timeline is not the same. It's going to, have maybe happen post-election, but also the issue of how is the data shared. In some countries where we work, the prosecutor was asked by the EMB, the election management body. We shared all those cases with you of potential election crime. Did you investigate? And they said, well, there's nothing we could do. It was like a Word document with some information. We needed evidence. We needed those cases to be built already. And I think that's where we saw in our work the need for this interinstitutional cooperation and this dialogue between election management body, for instance, when they're in charge of campaign finance or political finance, or whether it's the anti-corruption agency who is in charge of this mandate, together with prosecutors to really, as Laura said, set those clear guidelines of who does what and when. And we've seen some good practices of this interinstitutional cooperation. For instance, in the last election in Kenya, we were lucky to have great partners with the judiciary and the election commission, who set up those series of joint trainings on election-related offense, which covered political finance as well, with magistrates together with the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutor. And then the election management body held a few workshops with the Office of Director of Public Prosecutor. They signed a memorandum of understanding to try to initiate this process of sharing quickly evidence and information regarding election offense during and after the election, because of course, we tend to think that this stops, but the investigation usually on election related crimes will start, will continue and start after the election process. And so we see, I mean, those dialogue and discussion, again, to whether we call it guidelines or just, you know, sharing practices, exchange between institutions as really key to strengthen the effective investigation of this type of violation. Another good practice that refer so back to what Laura said again about those clear and transparent rules is in Armenia in the last election, there was the people would actually refer first, it seems, to the prosecution office for some types of violation. And when it was not criminal, they would send it back to the CEC, which I think is quite interesting. So it was not exclusive, it was not for political finance related, only it related to vote buying, election violence related violation, but just something to consider. But of course, we know that prosecution offices are also stretched with resources financially and staffing wise, but that also some kind of mechanism of referring back when it's not a crime that could allow for some kind of administrative sanction that can be imposed quicker.
Thank you, Typhaine. And we are going into the final round of questions. And we are going to turn to lessons learned and solution based on your experience. So my first question is to Pauline. What lessons learned would you share with other CSOs that may be interested in initiating strategic litigation on political finance offenses?
Yeah, that's a broad topic, right? So Anticor is now 20-year experienced in this. And I think one of the big things that we have to manage every day is balance between the size of the topic in the media and the impact it has on citizens. So what I mean is you have this big media cases that everybody know about and that you should probably do something about if you want your credibility to be there. However, we have a set of criteria in the organization, and one is we don't launch an act unless there is nothing that is moving from the administrative side on its own. Meaning, if the prosecutor does his job, we don't like put a claim on a claim just because we want to fight something. So we do fight something when we see it's a little tricky or a little blocked. But if the case is going on by himself, even though it's like the big headers everywhere in the press, we don't do that. So that might be tempting, but we would advise to, you know, think about the added value, like using it well, the few resources that we have, as we already mentioned. And one is don't disregard the big small cases, you know, the small village of 800 inhabitants where like maybe the mayor did something wrong. And in that specific village at this little local scale, like it disgusts everyone, like everybody is just so mad about that, but that's a very little thing. Maybe it's 20,000 euro, right? But like everybody is just really mad and upset about how this is going. And this is like discrediting the democracy at this so small little scale. So we do that as well. We do a lot of small cases like that are really symbolic. And of course, on the strategy, we also go for this cases that might change the case law or exemplify what doesn't work in the current law. So we really try to go for these strategic ones as well. And they can be small, but have like legal consequences. So that would be something. And one I would also, which is very precious to Anticor, is we're not against politicians. So this is very tricky and very easy to go from an anti-corruption association to an anti-politician association. And that's not what we want to be. We have politicians, we have people like involved in political parties in the association. And for us, it's very important that we, one, do not take side. So it's every party member can join Anticor, and that's fine. And it's also important to like not dismiss we want to build up trust in democracy. We don't want to destroy this trust. So that's why when we like build cases and raise claims against or initiate like criminal proceedings against some persons, we also try on the side to have some prevention actions. some positive things. So once a year we give like ethical prize to the guys who did good things, and they can be politicians, and they can be judges, and they can be journalists. But it's important to balance both, because if you just claim like they're corrupted, in the end, that's the only thing people hear, and we don't want people to stop voting and to stop, believing in the democratic system. So that's maybe a trick not to fall into, and I would say we're struggling on that. Well, we're putting all our efforts in that.
Thank you, Pauline. My next question is to Alexandra. Do you have similar guidelines as in the US and in France in the National Anti-Corruption Directorate on investigations against violators? And what other tools you find would be valuable to share with other institutions or best practices?
No, actually, we do not have mandatory guidelines as they have in the US, for example, because the status of the prosecutor is quite different in Romania. So mandating how you would act or how you will get your evidence in the investigation would be a breach of the independence of the prosecutor in Romania. But we do have other tools that help us somehow direct our investigations. For once, we have a separate section in our directorate. Our colleagues that go to court with the cases investigated by the National Anti-Corruption Directorate, and part of their work is actually to gather the case law of the courts and to discuss with the investigative prosecutors, which are somehow similar to investigative judges in Spain and France. We do have a discussion on what worked and how the courts see a type of case, or how they see the level of evidence gathered. So this helps us actually create our own guidelines in the prosecution office, we do see what kind of cases worked and which of them did not go to court. So we do have an evaluation of our cases that stopped in the investigation phase. So these are the two major tools that we use in order to have a personal guideline tool in the investigation. And of course, we do have a lot of legal doctrines. You do read a lot. And one other tool that we use is the comparative law. So we see what happens in other countries, especially with the EU countries, which have a legal system that is closer to Romania and then the common law system. So we see what kind of cases our colleagues from other jurisdictions investigated and how they approached a certain type of case. But we do not see mandatory rules for investigation, and not in the electoral crimes and domain, but in other cases we do have projects and programs that are managed by the general prosecution, and we have some guides on how to investigate or how to better investigate types of cases. We do have this kind of guidelines or solutions that came from the case law and from other investigations that are public, because they are publicly funded projects, and that we can use when we talk about corruption cases or money laundering or violent crimes. In this electoral domain, because we do not have specific legislation that criminalize violation of financing electoral processes and political party funding, we do not have guidelines or guides that can apply directly.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. I now turn to Laura. As the Executive Director of EFOR, could you share more about the existing work of EFOR and the rising interest on political finance in the anti-corruption community?
So I will pick up the line of Pauline, where she left it, little things that matter. We also believe that change starts with little things, and we are true believers in democracy. So in everything we do, our main goal is how can everything that we do be used to foster democracy and to ensure that rule of law is going upwards in Romania. So anti-corruption is, of course, very important, but it has to be subsumed basically to this higher goal of having and building a democratic society where citizens feel free and empowered to actually voice their concerns and to decide their future. So yes, we work a lot with youth to build the demand for good governance tomorrow, because we really believe that it shouldn't be a handful of people that care about these things, or else we lose. The battle cannot be won by a handful of people. So this has to be relevant for a large part of the society, and demand has to come grassroots. And yes, maybe demand refers to little things. Little things, if you look from up high, but if you look at the individual level, those little things are actually the big things that matter. So what we try to do is to give the tools to these young people to become citizens of tomorrow, citizens that can use properly their rights. Also, something that we do is to fight for the survival of the weaponry for citizenship that exists right now in Romania and in the EU. For example, we do a lot of strategic litigation on freedom of information, because unfortunately, and I'm old enough to remember that, in the early 2000s, when this movement came to Eastern Europe, I feel that there was more awareness as to why it is so important to have public information actually made public and publicly available to citizens, not just to label it public information. I think sometimes we have forgotten the importance of this essential element of publicity and accessibility of information held by the government. And we actually decided to take cases to court to fight for it, so that the generation that comes after us still has a Freedom of Information Act to use. We also see worrying trends coming from Brussels. For example, the directive on whistleblowers, which for Romania meant that, in fact, you can no longer go directly to NGOs or to the media to complain about what's going wrong in your institution, because the directive allows for a hierarchy of reporting channels. And first you have to go inside the public administration, and only afterwards you can go outside. So for us, that is actually decreasing the standard of protection that has been allowed for whistleblowers by the Romanian legislation so far. So all these little things add up, I think, to a stronger anti-corruption community, and we keep on taking the word further, because I don't think anti-corruption should be something that only a few NGOs that have anti-corruption in their name do. This is relevant for service providers, for NGOs working with people with vulnerable status. This is relevant for almost everybody. Yeah? This is about how public affairs are conducted in a country. So we do try to put out resources for the use of everybody, and to teach people how to use our resources, NGOs, civic activists, but also journalists. And I think only if you increase this constituency for good governance, you can actually make progress.
Thank you so much, Laura. And my last question goes to Typhaine. As a member of IFES Center for Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust, can you tell us a bit more about IFES's work to ensure that institutions can effectively address political finance violation in this common fight against impunity?
Yeah, so with the Center Anti-Corruption and Democratic Trust, we're lucky to work actually not just with institution, with the diversity of partners in the region, but also globally. And we work with civil society organization, election management body, anti-corruption agencies, as well as with the judiciaries. And so we support the development of assessment on accountability and autonomy framework, monitoring methodology, assisting CSOs with developing abuse of state resources, monitoring methodology or political finance, monitoring. We've also been involved with the conduct of trainings on investigation techniques and adjudication of election disputes. We also contribute to some legal and regulatory reform. Even if at the beginning of this webinar we said it's improving, there's still a lot of work to be done on improving the legislation and rules on illicit financing in politics and campaigns. And we also engage with judges and more recently also with prosecutors on this peer-to-peer exchange on election corruption related disputes. And we've developed over the years a series of tools. I think one of my colleagues, I'll just drop it in the chat. Recently, we've developed a vote for free guide that was released earlier, at the end of last year, which is a methodology on monitoring for civil society organization. We also have an election investigation guidebook for those of you who are interested, and we'll add that to the chat. And more recently, we're also finalizing a module on election-related offenses for judges and judicial officers. And of course, as Laura mentioned, together with the Silly Institute, we are really excited about this ongoing investigation research on integrity breaches, which I hope will keep everybody informed who is interested in the findings, hopefully in the coming months. So thank you, Nikki.
Thank you so much, Typhaine, and to all our panelists. We will now take questions. So if anyone has a question or a comment, you can use the Q&A function and type those in. In the meantime, while you are going to be doing it, we already received a couple of questions, so I will start reading them out. I have an open question for everyone, all our panelists. Any success story you'd like to share on investigation recently? So who would like to go first?
Let me break the ice. Okay. We have these tools, as I said, and I was telling you that they've been used by investigative journalists. So basically, they looked at who's getting contracts in a particular county in Romania, and they traced that company, and they discovered that the company belonged to an advisor in the Ministry of Local Development, which is the ministry that is giving the money for these investments. And then investigative journalists went and interviewed the mayors in the communities of which schools have been rehabilitated by this company. And at some point, the mayor openly said to the investigative journalists that yes, of course, we were pressured, and yes, of course, this is why we contracted with this company. He was also very unhappy about the quality of works. But he basically articulated our suspicion that, in fact, you get the money, but provided that you pay to a particular company that is politically related. And then a proper investigation started with prosecutors coming into the story, using the product of the investigative journalist and many other products that are, of course, only usable during proper criminal investigation. So this is a success story, and it's not the only one, but it shows how things have to work together so that change happens.
Thank you so much, Laura. Any other of our panelists who want to share a success story?
Well, not yet. We have we have a lot of success stories in the making, but now they are on the desks of the judges, so we're waiting for things. But we had a lot of opportunities in several cases to receive like simple citizens showing up with documentations and saying, well, I got a call last time that was from a lady. She's been fired because of whistleblowing in a company. That was tax evasion, was it? It was tax evasion and environmental matters. And she was like, now, okay, I'm suing for my employment law question, but I don't want these papers to get lost. Would you take them on? So that happens all the time, that the investigation, I mean, the question was on the evidences management, right? So they show up and then we build a case and we put it in front of a judge. It's not yet a success story because justice is so long, but at least the simple fact that someone is actually dedicating time and energy to say, okay, I'll give you that document because I think that you can do something with it, which is in the public interest, is already something that we praise ourselves for.
Thank you, Pauline. Anyone else?
Yes, we actually, even if we do not have specific legislation for crimes that relate to financing to the finance of political parties, we do have a recent success story where the suspect actually chose to admit the crime and had a plea bargain. The former treasurer of one of the main political parties in Romania was investigated by my colleagues in the National Anti-Corruption Directorate for using the subsidies that the state budget gave to political parties, to using these subsidies in his own interest, for paying for actually trips and holidays that he went to, and we actually managed to determine that he gave the money for his own interest to finance a way of life and spending the money that the state gave political parties actually to ensure for political plurality in Romania, and use them for personal benefits. And it was actually very quick investigation, and because he opted for a plea agreement, plea bargain, it actually was finalized quite quickly. So that would be a success story for the length of the judiciary proceedings, because some of the other panelists actually highlighted that the length of the proceedings is one major disadvantage in using the criminal investigation in dealing with electoral fraud.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, for sharing. And Tifa, did you want to add?
Sure. Yeah, I can share actually a recent case from, I think, last week from the Central Election Commission in Moldova. There is a criminal cases ongoing against a political party leader, but in the meantime, the Central Election Commission just came out with a sanction basically preventing a political party from getting access to public funding for a certain period of time. So then you can see the impact of like an administrative sanction quickly imposed to potentially, prevent further criminal violations, while of course there's still ongoing proceeding on the criminal side against a particular party. So that's, one of the things I think that we discussed today that can be looked at as a success story. But yes, but of course we would have many success stories from our partners, but not that we cannot claim as our own across the years.
Thank you, Typhaine. I want to be mindful of everybody's time. We have the last 5 minutes, so maybe we can squeeze in one more question. This question is also open to all our panelists. Is there not a risk that bringing attention to and sanctioning corruption cases further undermines public confidence in politics and elections? Who would like to chime in? Pauline, please.
I'm sorry, this was a mistake. I was actually going to type, can you repeat the question, because I didn't hear. But
oh, sorry, now I was muted. Yes, I will repeat the question. Is there not a risk that bringing attention to and sanctioning corruption cases further undermines public confidence in politics and the elections?
yeah, well, then that was what I was saying before. There is this risk, for sure. It exists. It exists, but I think it is like sound. It has to be measured. So that's why, like, anti-corruption activists, they have to be measured people. Otherwise, you quickly, and that is one of the risks as well. This is like to be instrumentalized. So you have to kind of have this neutral position, remain factual, and to avoid the risk, it's important to also praise those who do good. We have someone in France. She was a préfet, like a regional representative of the state, and she got fired because she refused to support building of a building project that was against the urbanistic law. And so she said, no, I won't permit it. And she was fired by a boss. And because she refused to apply the law, well, she applied the law. So that's typically, and this is the case that went everywhere in the newspaper as well. And the idea was, this lady was actually doing something good. So, okay, she got fired, but still it's important to see that you have people who stand by their values and who stand by their collective idea of democracy and having strong rule of law. So you can do both, and you have to do both if you want to be efficient. Otherwise, yeah, for sure, the risk exists, we believe.
Thank you so much, Pauline. Laura, your hand is up.
Well, I would argue a little bit differently. I would say that we should not be falling in the trap of thinking that people don't know about corruption if we don't talk about corruption. So if nobody talks about corruption, nobody investigates corruption, people just won't know. So they will trust the state because the state is not undermined by this bad talking about corruption and by investigating corruption. The corruption is visible on the streets. It's something that people are fully aware of. Their frustration comes from the fact that they don't perceive the state to be doing enough to tackle corruption. So while I think it is important to talk about democracy and also the role of citizens, because corruption has two sides, right? We often talk about the person that is taking the bribe and forget that someone is paying the bribe. So I do believe that we should talk about good examples, even good examples that end bad, like Pauline was explaining, someone that refuses to break the law and goes against those that have appointed her. So she's fired. Question is, what happens next? Do we stop here with the story, or do we try to do something about it? In this case, being a prefect, you know, that's a political nomination, so it's probably a bit more complicated to argue for against the dismissal. But I think actually trust in the state is more likely to increase if the state is perceived to actually be doing the right thing. And I can reference the big street protests that happened in Romania, with people going up in the streets in freezing weather to protest against measures that were intended by the government to undermine anti-corruption institutions. So it's a weird situation where the people go out to protect prosecutors, right? I mean, prosecution usually is not an institution that citizens feel strongly about. Whereas when prosecution is seen to be performing well and actually fighting the good fight, people would side with the prosecution. So I think the argument can be made both ways.
Thank you so much, Laura. Alexandra, maybe a short one. I apologize.
Yeah. I think that looking at the problem like this, it's a deterrent thing to actually highlight that corruption exists in the electoral system and in political parties, has the opposite effect. It actually normalizes corruption, and then not putting the spotlight on illicit activity from the political parties will tend to make them repeat themselves even more in the future. So this argument that it's a bad thing to investigate corruption in electoral system is like having a parallel. It's like saying that it's a bad thing to investigate violent activities because you will show violence that will increase violence, which I think it's a fallacy. So I think it's a good thing to show that any kind of illicit activity, no matter who the person who is performing the activity is investigated in the same with the same thoroughness as any other crime, from the prosecution office perspective, of course.
Thank you so much, Alexandra. So given the time, we came already to an end. I would like to thank our panelists for joining and for sharing their expertise. Also to our participants and my IFES colleagues for preparing this webinar. The next iteration of the webinar will be next month, 23rd of February, as it is coming up for the first anniversary, the 1-year anniversary of Russia attacking Ukraine. This webinar will be dedicated to Ukraine. So stay tuned and thank you again for joining us. Have a great day.